What's up, y'all? It's Dr. Paul with Liberty Hill Comics, where I share my passion and over 40 years of experience comic book collecting, investing, and conservation with you. Today, we're going to be continuing our new Golden Age comic book conservation project on this copy of All-Star Comics number 55 from 1950. Today, we're going to get back to work on the cover. First, we're going to do an aqueous submersion bath with warm calcium hydroxide and surfactant solution to clean and deacidify the cover. I'll show you exactly how I perform all the steps in detail, and then we're going to perform archival tear seals and cover reinforcement with Japanese paper and methyl cellulose glue. All of these methods and materials are archival and reversible, and importantly, CGC does not consider them restoration if you're interested in submitting your comic book for grading, which we intend to do with this book when we're done. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you are subscribed to the channel, thank you sincerely. If you hit the bell icon, you'll be notified when we have new videos going up. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do so. It helps us reach a wider audience here on YouTube and create more of a community around our favorite hobby, comic book conservation. In case you missed it, in episode 1 of this series, we did a complete walkthrough of the book, assessed the condition, paying special attention to any defects that affect grade, as well as use of the comic book and permanence of the paper. We determined we had a mostly solid and complete comic book that presented reasonably well and could be read with some care, but with some significant flaws. These include a severe spine roll, a piece missing to the cover, some chipping along the right edge of the front cover, and a severely tanned cover to the point of the paper being brown in the most severely tanned areas. The interior pages were, for the most part, beautiful, with off-white to cream pages and only a few minor flaws, including a pulled top staple on the centerfold and a few very small tears on the reading edge of the first few wraps. We estimated the grade at approximately a 3.0 or good, very good. We developed a conservation plan for this comic book that includes assessment and documentation, disassembly, wet clean and deacidification of the cover with tear seals and paper reinforcement, and the same treatment of the interior wraps as well. After we get everything cleaned, mended, and dried back out, we'll reassemble the book without the spine roll and give it a good finishing press. If the conservation is successful, we can expect a comic book that has cleaner and brighter paper with a new lease on life, usability, and permanence. The comic should have an improved grade and also be easier to read without risking further damage, and the natural lifespan of the comic should be extended by a century or so by virtue of the deacidification we'll perform. It should also present much better and all around be a better collectible. I intend to send it to CGC to be graded and enter it into my CGC registry collection as a placeholder until I can find a high-grade copy of this rare comic book for my collection. In episode 2 of this project, we disassembled the comic book, setting the staples aside for reassembly, preserving their location and orientation information. Then, we did a few more measurements of the paper quality and dimensions of the cover and set it aside for deacidification, tear seals, and reinforcement at a later date. In episode 3, we did an aqueous deacidification bath of the first interior wrap with a calcium hydroxide solution and also performed archival tear seals with Japanese paper and a methyl cellulose glue. These methods are reversible and considered by CGC as conservation, so when performed correctly, do not result in a purple, restored label if you submit to CGC for grading, which we intend to do with this book. In episode 4, we reviewed the results from our wet clean and tear seal procedures on the first inner wrap, and I showed you the method I use for washing the rest of the inner wraps in a fraction of the time by washing 2 wraps at a time and using a surfactant and warm water. I also showed you how to use a heated press to speed up dry time dramatically. This Golden Age treasure has 12 inner wraps plus the cover. So these techniques will help us get the entire book conserved in a reasonable amount of time so we can get it off to CGC. I've created a playlist for this project. You can check it out to see all the videos in the series by following the link in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Alright, we've got a lot of ground to cover today with this cover, so let's get started. I ordered an 18-inch ruler. In fact, I ordered 2 of them, and I'm just going to use this one to hold this cover flat so that I can measure it. So because of that spine roll, it has some crinkles, it has some bends that keep it from laying perfectly flat, but this ruler will help. And on the bottom, I'm at 14 inches in about 5/30 seconds. And incidentally, that's the same that we measured with the 2 rulers that I stacked. But I noticed that the book is a little bit thicker here in the middle. And I'm not sure if this is because the book was cut unevenly during manufacture or because of that crinkling. But here we have a full 14 3/16. Not much, but enough to make note of, and I am glad I have those measurements. We'll take some measurements throughout the process today. So this cover is going to go into my humidity chamber prior to starting any work. I'm just going to get it centered between a few pieces of Hollytex substrate to make it more handleable when it's wet. And then it's going to go inside my humidity chamber, which is pre-humidified to 98% relative humidity at room temperature, and I'm going to leave it there overnight. And this is the solution for the first wash. It's 25% saturated calcium hydroxide. I'm going to have 500 mils total, so that's 125 mils of the calcium hydroxide, 375 mils warm tap water, 5 drops Triton X100. So the next morning, I'm ready to start my wash. This is warm water, so it's going on this hot plate at about 40 centigrade. And I'm going to add a stir bar just to distribute the heat as I warm it up. I'm going to warm it up to about 60 centigrade. I'm going to add 5 drops of Triton X100 today because I'm going to have 500 total mLs. We did a video on the critical micelle concentration of Triton X100 and why you only need 1 drop per 100 mLs, and in fact why using more than that is detrimental to the project for conservation. And I'll put a link here to that video if you want to check it out. I'm going to transfer the cover from my humidity chamber into my photo development tray where we're going to do the washes today. And I definitely want the cover to be centered inside the Hollytex here. So, excuse me for a moment, I'm going to go ahead and manipulate it and make sure that we have it well placed so that we can manipulate it safely. The other thing I'm doing is I'm going to check this ragged edge and make sure that all the little flaps of loose paper, none of them are folded back on the rest of the cover, that they're all either flat or going to be flat when the Hollytex comes down on them. All right, I'm satisfied with that. I think we're ready now to put together the rest of our solution. I have a saturated calcium hydroxide solution here. You do want to keep this capped. It will react with CO2 in the air. It'll form calcium carbonate, which isn't a big deal, but it's just less effective as a buffer. Because I'm making a total of 500 mLs, I have 375 water, I have 125 saturated calcium hydroxide. I'm going to mix them together right in the photo development tray. Retrieve my magnetic stir bar. I'm going to use a squeegee here to push out any air bubbles and make sure I have the paper wetted very well. This is sized paper, so it's ordinarily hydrophobic, but you'll see it's wetting quite nicely here. That's due to a combination of factors. The fact that we're using a surfactant helps, warm water helps, as does the fact that we pre-humidified the page. And the Polytex has a huge surface area owing to the non-woven fibrous nature, and it is in fact a wettable hydrophilic material, so it really helps to get the water in close proximity to the paper, which is the trick to getting a maximum wash effect here. The initial time that you do this, there is a natural tendency for air bubbles to form. That's just small pockets of air that are held within the Polytex that are being displaced as the water weaves its way in. This is 2.5 minutes into the wash. I'm just going to go ahead and flip the page. You'll note there's already considerable amount of tanning that's been removed from the cover. And I didn't show this in my last video. I got a question about it. So I'm not doing any rocking or stirring. I'm just doing this flip at 2.5 minutes in. And here we are at 5 minutes now. And I'm going to remove the page from this wash. Remember, this is the only wash we'll do with a surfactant, the Triton X100. Effectively, it is a very mild, non-ionic, well-defined soap. And obviously at 5 drops, we don't have a lot of it, but it's very effective. I'm going to let the page rest on paper towels here, and this blotting effect will help draw the last of that dirty rinsate out of the page. And then we can pour off this rinsate and have a look at it. Let me get my trusty Kerr quart jar here. It's pretty dirty. This was a severely tanned page, though. Remember, it was brown. In fact, on one corner, on one edge, it was actually darker than the darkest brown on the Overstreet whiteness level card. So let's have a look. As we expected, very dark rinsate here. And so we're obviously going to do a second wash. This wash is the same as the first, minus the Triton X100, so it's rinsing the surfactant out in addition to getting rid of any acids and tanning and leaving a alkaline buffer in the paper. So this is 375 mils warm water, 125 mils saturated calcium hydroxide solution. And in we go. The whole sandwich is already wetted, so really no need for squeegee here. And I will do the same thing here at 2.5 minutes. Just flip the page. As you pull the page out in this Polytex sandwich, the water just gets pulled out of it, the water that has the closest proximity to the page, and that brings new fresh water up in proximity when you put it back in. So that's the real purpose for doing that. It's a non-abrasive way to sort of effectively rock it or create a little bit of convective flow to go along with the diffusion that's happening. This is 5 minutes now, obviously. I'm going to go ahead and extract it by sliding it off the edge of the photo development tray, placing it on paper towels again. These are obviously fresh paper towels. They're fresh in that they're not the ones I used the last time, but they have been reused. This is one of their last uses because I don't mind them being a little wrinkly or even, frankly, having a little tanning already in them. That's not going to affect the use here. This rinsate's quite a bit cleaner, quite a bit clearer. In fact, it's almost clear enough to call it good, but I think, we'd like this cover to be as bright as possible without any harsh chemicals, so we're going to wash it one more time, but that rinsate looks quite good to me. All right, one more time, same solution. 375 mils warm tap water. I have well water that's double filtered here, but it is limestone well water, so it starts off already with some calcium reserve in it. And then 125 mils of my saturated calcium hydroxide solution. I have to remind myself, for some of you, this will be the first time you're seeing one of my videos. Although this is a basic solution, it's quite safe to handle, so no concerns for my skin, no concerns with disposal vis-a-vis safe to put down the drain. Here I am flipping it at the 2.5 minute mark, and you see almost no tanning coming out of the paper at this point. So I think our surfactant was really effective. We essentially washed the bulk of the contaminants out of the paper with the very first wash, and we just had an intermediate rinse and this rinse here. I'd like to minimize the total amount of time in water because I don't want inks to run. We have some really vibrant reds and oranges and yellows on the cover. And it's always a trade-off between longer washes removing more contamination, but potentially leading to some ink loss and or ink bleed through the paper. And I'd love to minimize that. So I'm going to call it right here, and I'm effectively already drying this page off to get it ready for paper mending. I'm going to collect this rinsate here, but unfortunately, in my haste to get onto paper mending, I poured this out. So there's your only look at it. But I think you can tell it's quite clear, and I'm satisfied that we got a sufficient wash of this page. Now I've transferred the page to my workstation with my overhead camera view, and I'm just going to get it a little bit wet so that I can flatten it out really smooth on this hobby mat. So I'm just misting it with 25% calcium hydroxide solution. That's effectively the same solution that it was just washed in. And once I have the page sufficiently wet that I can move the paper around safely without damaging it, I'm going to use my squeegee to flatten the page out, get really billiard table flat on my hobby mat here. And I actually squeegeed the whole page 3 times, but it's kind of tedious to watch. So I am not showing you the first 2 passes. This is the third and final pass with the squeegee. Nice and slow. I'm making sure that I don't have any air bubbles underneath the page, and that it's sufficiently dry for us to get a successful paper mend. We have the entire spine to reinforce, and there is a spine split the last inch, I believe, of the top, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have this entire edge to do tear seals and reinforcement on the left edge as we're looking at it here. And I want the paper to be, I always describe it as a sponge that's been wrung out. It's still wet, but it has capacity to store more fluid because I want it to absorb the glue during our paper mending steps. So for fun, I decided to measure the width while I had it wet here on the hobby mat. And look at this. It's nearly a 1/4 inch wider here on the bottom with it wet and flattened out than it was when we measured it dry. Very interesting. It makes sense. Paper obviously expands when it absorbs water, but I'm not sure anybody would have guessed an entire 1/4 inch in width here. We'll keep an eye on it. I'm really interested to see what it ends up being after all of our washing and paper mending. All right, now that we've gathered all the information and data that we wanted to, time to get working on our paper mending. I'm pulling this away very slowly because some of those little pieces of paper may actually be completely loose, and I certainly don't want them to come with the Hollytex here. I want them to stay on the substrate Hollytex, which is why you saw me pull that away so slowly. I'm using Japanese paper tengujo today. This is 5 grams per square meter, and I've torn it in a relatively straight-edged strip by pinning it with a ruler and then tearing the edge. And I want to place it just so. I want to capture the staple holes, but I also really want to reinforce that part of the cover that had the really severe spine roll and where we have a piece of paper missing. I also don't want to stretch it too much. I don't want it to be under tension here. We're going to be gluing the tengujo paper to the comic book paper, and I don't want there to be, as they dry out, here's my methyl cellulose glue. I get from Line Co. through Amazon. I just make it according to the manufacturer's instructions. I'm going to use a number 5 sable brush. As I was saying, I don't want my tengujo paper to be tight here, taut, because as it dries, I don't want there to be differential contraction anywhere or anything that's just going to put a curl or a twist in my paper. I'm going to place my glue down in the center of the strip and brush outward with light strokes. The goal here is to get good penetration of the glue down into the paper through the tengujo, but not to leave big puddles behind. This methyl cellulose glue is quite lubricious. Methyl cellulose is actually the main ingredient of water-based personal lubricants, so it slips here quite easily, and it should really glide right over the work. So I decided to put a strip down the center and then to brush that glue outward toward that feathered edge once I get a strip down the center and deposit some glue all the way down the center of the spine. So I'm putting it on a little bit heavy here because I'm going to come back with a drier brush later and kind of brush it out in both directions, left and right. I don't want to give the impression that that's the finished amount of glue because it's going to be drier when we're done with it here. So now I'm coming back with just a lightly wetted brush, not really a dry brush, not really a wet brush, and I'm just going to brush out the glue very lightly, lifting the brush so that I don't leave puddles behind. And work my way down the spine here on the left. One of the reasons we have a frayed edge to our tengujo is it increases the surface area, also makes it so there isn't a hard edge. It's a more gradual edge that's less detectable to the eye and to feel. So a successful mend and reinforcement here involves not only having that nice torn edge for the tengujo, but also brushing away and having all those little fibers spread out, maximizing their contact with the paper from the comic book. If you brush it back toward the center line of the book here, you'd be taking all those little fibers and bending them back in on themselves and in on the rest of the paper, and actually creating weak spots in the repair. So again, now I'll handle the left side, start on the center line and brush out. Very gentle touch here. I don't want to leave big puddles behind. So I'll continue to work it until I have it wet, but not super saturated and not with a puddle of the glue setting on the surface. There's the top staple. Just nice to reinforce that. I think even though we didn't have a lot of tears, because we had such a severe spine roll, and we're already going to get conserved grade on this book, to me it just makes sense to reinforce this entire spine, ensure that we'll have strong staple holes, ensure that we won't have a further split of the spine, and ensure that when we put the correct fold back in the spine, when we correct the spine roll, that the paper is going to be strong and is going to take that fold and not crumble or crack. Remember, the Overstreet whiteness level card showed a dark brown and it said brittle next to it. And our paper was actually darker than that brown. So we didn't see a lot of evidence of brittleness, but this paper has every potential to be actually quite brittle. And the way that that leading edge, the edge that we'll repair next here, is tattered, could indicate brittle paper. So we certainly want to do everything we can in our conservation to make sure that as we're repairing the page, we're not introducing any problems. I'll leave that area to dry while I place the tengujo on this edge. And here we're doing a combination of tear seals and reinforcement because we do have a lot of small tears there. Technically, those are two different categories of paper mending in conservation and according to CGC. So it's worth noting, but in practice, they're effectively the same. And I'm happy with that, so I'm ready to apply some methylcellulose glue here as well. And I'll just start at the top, as is my habit. Note that I take a little bit of effort not to glue the tengujo to the Hollytex. I want to try to keep the glue on the surface between the page and the tengujo. And again, I'm just going to brush it away from the center line. Light strokes. Oh, I just realized some of these little fragments should have been aligned. I should have done this really before I placed the tengujo paper down, but I'll correct it now. No big deal. These little fragments have all but given up the ghost. But we'll just align them slightly better so that the graphics will look a little better. It's still going to be obvious that this is a repaired edge, and the edge is not going to look great. I made the comment when we did our walkthrough that ironically when we repair this edge, it may actually look worse because the spine roll was kind of tucking it away and off the page, and we're going to be pulling it back sort of more toward the center line of your view when we correct the spine roll. And that's going to expose some of the paper underneath the cover, especially on the top there where we have paper wholesale missing from the cover. Here again, I'm doing something similar to what I did on the center line. I'm putting a heavier layer of the methylcellulose down on the edge, and then I'm going to come back with a slightly drier brush and feather it out. So not a dry brush for those of you that may have an art background. but just not a really heavy wet brush. And when it becomes transparent, I know I've done my job. And when it's transparent and doesn't have a puddle, I know I've done my job well. So that's what I'm shooting for here. Isn't it amazing to see that indicia from 1950? 74 years later. Not quite, I suppose. This is October, November. Still very cool. And I'm going to do a final brush. This is a little drier yet. And this is very light touch. We're just picking up any puddles, distributing the glue as evenly as we can along this edge. And I'll go back, and if I see any wet spots, the work I did earlier, I'll just touch them real quick with a very light brush. You see this is drying quite nicely. The methyl cellulose is being absorbed into the paper and should give us a very good bond. So I'm happy with that. I think we should get a good result here. Now that this is absorbed just a little bit longer, I'll give this one last little brush, really right at the edge of the fibers, just to make sure there's no puddles, especially on the page where there is no tengujo. Last step here is to put the Hollytex back in place. I'd really like to place it so that we don't have any wrinkles, but the Hollytex is wet on the right and relatively dry on the left here as you're viewing it, and so getting it flat probably going to take just a little bit of work here. You do have to be careful too when you lift your Hollytex. It can take the tengujo up with it if you're not careful. But I think a very light touch here. And then I think the thing to do is to just lift the right side, the wet side of the Hollytex. Just lift it and then set it back down gently. I think that's the way to get these few wrinkles out of the Hollytex. And this is important because I'm about to dry this, and I'd very much like to dry it in a manner where I'm not going to be putting any wrinkles into the paper from any source. Good, satisfied with that. I'm going to start with just 2 paper towels on top here and my repurposed granite. And I'll change this out after about a half hour. I'll change it out again after about 2 hours, and then again after 4 hours. And then I'll make a decision about whether or not I decide to put this in the heated press. Let's wrap it up there. Next episode, we'll reveal the results from our rapid deacidification bath for the inner wraps and have a look at how this cover turned out. And then we're in the home stretch with this project. We can start thinking about putting this comic book back together. Most of the materials I used today are available from Amazon in the affiliate links in the video description if you need any of them for your own conservation projects. And if you enjoyed this video, please take a few seconds to give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Until next time, take care of one another.